And this is where we're going to pick the story up in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Mark chapter 5 has been called the St. Jude chapter of the New Testament. For, I don't know if you know, but St. Jude is the patron saint of hopeless causes, or hopeless, lost causes, I should say. But as we saw with the healing of the demoniac and about this, as we're about to see in this story, nothing is too difficult for our God. So after Jesus being asked to leave, he set sails to cross over the Sea of Galilee to Capernaum, which by this time had become the main base of operation for Jesus. And when he returned, there a large crowd was waiting for him. Now, they probably knew that he would return at some point, because, as I said, this is his main operating. This is where he mainly went out from. This became his headquarters, as it were. And they probably knew that he would return there at some point, so were waiting. And the news would have spread quickly. When they saw the boats coming back, people would have been on the lookout for it. And when they saw it coming up, that word would have spread like wildfire. And the crowds all gathered around the boat as it landed. In verse 22-24, then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with them. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Synagogue rulers were people in high positions. He would have been a man of some great expertise. He would have been a man, it was a very important person in the community. He was a man of real high standing, as it were. And he was the person who had the responsibility of administration of the synagogue, of ordering, of bringing the worship all together, of making everything happen, as it were. He would have been the leading light in the church. And despite his position, and knowing that the religious leaders of that day were against Jesus, he went to Jesus anyway. His position, his standing in community, it meant nothing to him compared to the life of his daughter. And he came, and it says, and he fell at Jesus' feet and was begging him, please, I can just see the pain and the heartache that this guy, his little girl, is dying, and he's pleading with Jesus. Jesus, will you, please, will you come and heal my little girl? No doubt he'd seen and heard of other miracles that Jesus had done in Capernaum. And he wasn't caring about what people were thinking. He wasn't caring what the community were going to say about this leading light of the church going to Jesus, a man that they've already decided is evil and is of the devil. He's not worried about that, because his little girl was sick. And he knew she was at death's door. He knew that she was literally dying. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if somebody came to you and said, your daughter or your son is about to die? How you would feel? That's how that man felt. I mean, he was desperate to see Jesus do something. And he didn't care about what people thought. He was more interested in what Jesus would do. And note that Jesus never ever turns anyone away. Those who come to me, I will in no ways cast out. That's John 6:37. And Jesus agreed to Jairus' request, but the crowds were such that Jesus could hardly move, and he was being crushed by them, which no doubt made Jairus even more frantic, as it was delaying him getting to his daughter. No doubt he'd have been there frantically. I can just see him trying to push people out of the way. Come on, get out of the way. Jesus needs to get through here. I need to get to my daughter. And then all of a sudden, the story changes. Because if you look at the next couple of verses, it's a completely different story. Because it goes on to say, And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she got worse. You know, here was a woman who suffered greatly for 12 years. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. She'd lost her health, she'd lost her wealth, paying for all these doctors to get a cure, but nothing worked. No matter what she tried, what she did, nothing worked. So she would have been shunned by society as being ceremonially unclean. If you remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about how being unclean, how it affected people. And people would do everything not to be unclean. Because you wouldn't be able to touch anybody. You wouldn't be able to be hugged by anybody. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't go to church. You couldn't worship. Can you imagine what that would be like? You know, Leviticus 15:9 tells us that women in their monthly cycle were unclean, and anyone who touched her would be unclean till evening. She wouldn't be able to go to the family gatherings. She would be isolated. No wonder she was desperate. And according to the medicine of that time, this woman, her disease was incurable. And after all the woman had gone through, she still had hope. And what was that hope in? That hope was in Jesus. If only I could touch the hem of his garment, as we'll see. Because it says, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. You know, she must have heard about Jesus and the miracles and thought, if only I can just reach out and just the hem of his garment. You'll never know. Nobody will know. I'll just touch the hem and I'll be healed. She didn't want to make Jesus unclean, so she came up with this plan to come up behind him and touch the hem of his robe. And no doubt it would have been difficult with the crowd. You know, can you imagine the crowd would have been pushing her? How did she get through? I can just picture her on her hands and knees, you know, pulling people's legs away. I'll just get through there, pushing her way through just to get to Jesus. Because Jesus wouldn't have been going very fast because of the crowd that were round about. But she was determined to get to Jesus, to touch the hem of his garment. And she would have there on her hands and knees crawled and would have just touched it. And look what happens in verse 5. As soon as she touches it, in verse 29 it said, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. No sooner had she touched Jesus, just a hem, and she was instantly healed. And she knew it. She would have known that the bleeding had stopped. She would have felt energy flow through her body. She must have thought to herself, I'll just sneak away now. Now that I've got that, I'll just sneak away and nobody will know and I'll just get out of the way. But Jesus wasn't having any of that. Because at once, it says, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? Jesus knew that power had gone out from him to heal. So he asked, who touched him? You know, Psalm 50:15 says, call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. Well, this woman indeed called upon Jesus in her time of trouble and was healed. But she hadn't completed the circle. She hadn't given glory to God for her healing. And Jesus didn't want her just to go away feeling as though she'd stolen something. He wanted her to be able to tell people that she had been set free so she could indeed glorify God. And her healing would again mean that she could engage in society, to have someone touch her, you know, just to have someone give her a hug. And she would have been able to worship God. And can you imagine what it would have been like for after 12 years, never ever been allowed to go into church. She was allowed to go to the temple again, to give praise and glory to God. As I say, no doubt she just wanted to sneak away quietly, but Jesus wasn't having that. He wanted to know who touched me, and he was looking around, because it says in verse 31, you see the people crowd against you, his disciples answered, and you ask, who touched me? I can understand why the disciples were confused. Lord, there's hundreds of them here. What are you talking about? So what the disciples were actually saying here, to put it in modern day vernacular, as it were, having a laugh, Lord, aren't you? That's what they're basically saying. You're having a joke here, aren't you? Who's touched me? There's millions of them. What are you on about? Yeah, I could just see them. Very funny, Jesus. Yeah, we get that one, But the disciples were unaware that power had gone out from Jesus. Jesus knew that somebody had been healed. Jesus knew that the power had gone. But they didn't. So they just thought, somebody's touched me. But they didn't realize that power had gone out. But Jesus knew exactly what happened and was looking for the person, because it says in verse 32 and verse 33, but Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Jesus must have shouted it out, because the woman heard him, and her conscience would not allow her just to slip away. And she came back and fell at Jesus' feet, trembling, because she knew she'd been healed. She knew what she'd done, and probably wasn't the right way of doing it. She knew she shouldn't even have touched the man, never mind talk to him. And she shared the story how she had been plagued with hemorrhaging for 12 years. And yet she had spent all her money on doctors and spent everything that she had. But they couldn't heal her. And she thought, Lord, if only I could touch the hem of your garment, I would be healed. And I did. And immediately, I was healed. And did we see what's happened here? She's now completed the circle. She's now acknowledging and giving the glory to God, because he has set her free. And the people would have been looking at what Jesus would do. For in those days, it wasn't right for women. Women shouldn't touch men in any shape or form. We've got to understand that this is a different culture to the culture we have today. Totally different. Women weren't even allowed to speak out in the open air without their husband's permission. They shouldn't speak to men. She should not be even speaking to Jesus. But Jesus broke with those traditions. And he asked her the question. But look at the Jesus response. And he said in verse 30, he said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.